So thank you again for making it. I'm super excited for this session today on using one-time funds. Like I said, this is a rapidly evolving topic that, while timeless, as there are always, there's always been one-time funding. It's become much more front and center as the pandemic has worn on, and there have been higher education emergency response dollars, and then the possibility for money directly for student success purposes as part of the present reconciliation negotiations. So we're really going to take two takes on this topic today, right? So first, we want to examine the best uses of one-time funding, regardless of the source, such that how to review returns on investment, figure out how to optimize financing your student success agenda. Donna has worked on this sort of thing her whole career, having been with RPK several years, and prior to that being a principal researcher at AIR and deputy director of the Delta Cost Project on post-secondary education. And then second, we want to examine not just the federal landscape, but also, really get into the approach the U.S. Department of Education is likely to take towards funding student success initiatives under the new leadership there, and what evidence thresholds they'll be looking at, and how you can be set up for success in that regard. And Kate from the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS, will tackle much of that as she's worked on federal policy and its intersection with evidence of post-secondary reforms that promote social mobility. And I'm also going to go over a few slides right now, just really quick, just to frame our discussion. So first, where we are. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think our presenters are going to go into this more. But we've had our HEERF dollars in 3 phases, mostly funded in the 3rd round, which also had the most flexibility, and I break that out here. I'll share these slides later, but in the interest of time, want to jump to where we're headed. Now, obviously, this is still very much day-to-day and in flux, including today, but the Build Back Better proposals that are going through reconciliation are presently moving through in a truncated form. I think a very important theme, of course, is, truncated, yes, but still of likely very significant impact on the higher education sector, because these are investments that are being made where no such investments have happened in the past. And while free community college is basically pulled from the bill, we know that as of this morning, we're at a $550 increase on Max Pell as part of what's now shaping up to be a $1.85 trillion framework that's been laid out. Again, this is as of today, and I think Kate will have much more detail than me, and correct me if I get any of this wrong. Including I think the student success funding is also an ongoing thing, as is the MSI investment. Though there is a reference today to a 50% increase in Labor Department spending on workforce development for each year of the next 5 years. And there's much reference in that document to community colleges and registered apprenticeships. But again, there's more detail to be seen. So this is a timely topic that's changing, and we're getting more information by the moment. But just going into one-time funds more broadly for projects and operations, put here 3 considerations worth examining in tandem at once. How much a new initiative costs in total, whether it funds something one-time or ongoing, and what strictures are in place from the source of the funds. That last point, the purple circle, that may seem obvious, but if you have multiple sources of one-time funds at the same time, it's worth getting to going from perhaps you're most restricted to least if multiple sources could cover the same initiative. So these considerations certainly go for CCA initiatives, right? How should you use one-time funding for professional development purposes, curricular overhaul, tech infrastructure? And this is a lot that Donna is going to go into. And we have some high-level considerations here, starting with aligning with your strategic plan first and foremost, and considering sustainability, but then also getting emergency aid out and to the utmost, getting that done before looking into tech training and teaching and learning supports. I've got 2 slides that kind of look at that from a CCA specific angle. So first, we break this down in detail here, and I'll send these slides out. But this is how we see one-time funding opportunities aligning with CCA priorities as depicted in our 4 pillars of assuring that students have strong purpose or end goal or destination in mind, that they have momentum to get to that goal as fast as possible, that the road to get to it is structured out semester by semester along predictive block schedules that work for all types of students, including those with work and personal obligations, and that there are guardrails around that structured path in the form of student support. So I'll just call out that in each of these categories, there's much investment that can be done with one-time money, really in like 4 different categories, looking at this: process overhaul, professional development opportunities, technological infrastructure, and policy examination and audit. And on the point of tech, before I turn it over to Donna, I do want to call out data infrastructure especially. Now's a good time to make sure that your strategic plan is supported by data infrastructure to track against the metrics in it, as these will measure the success of all reform efforts depicted on your prior slide. And then like iteratively, that sort of evidence base becomes important for securing other, one-time funding sources, particularly going forward. So this likely looks like time spent getting this right, establishing data sources for each measure, and then building out the tech infrastructure in full. I want to finally call out that for those colleges, systems, and states that are participating in the National Student Clearinghouse's Post-Secondary Data Partnership, CCA engages in the operations that are essentially depicted in the top 3 bullets here as just standard alliance service. So let me know if you have questions about that or about the PDP. And also, we're working with states on helping consult and audit and overhaul for student success reforms based on one-time funding use. If you want to get in on that, just take 5 seconds now, shoot me a note. And we'll pick the conversation up. But I don't want to take any more time away from our guest speaker. So let me now turn it over to Donna.
Great. Thanks, Charles. I'm going to share my slides here. Great. Well, I'm pleased to join you all today to talk about HEERF funding and specifically how colleges and universities might think about using these one-time funds in a more strategic way to benefit their institutions. So, of course, we've had 3 rounds of HEERF funding already, totaling almost $77 billion. A portion of which is directed to students for direct student grants, and the balance of which is available for institutions to help defray expenses associated with the coronavirus. Whether that's recouping revenue losses that colleges and universities have experienced, or reimbursing for direct expenses that they've incurred as a result of managing the COVID impacts on campuses. Funds can be used to help keep students enrolled and academically engaged. I know some colleges have provided debt relief for students, but there is some capacity in there for forward-thinking strategies, I think, as we think about sort of keeping students actively and academically engaged as well. More than half of the total funds are available for institutional use. And as you may know, the sort of deadline for spending those funds is a year from the last administration. So for most colleges and universities, that's a year from last spring. So we're looking at next spring of 2022. So over the past 6 months, RPK Groups has been in meetings, workshops, conversations with almost 100 colleges, and we've really been thinking about best practices around the institutional portion of using these funds. So asking, really, how can institutions use this funding as strategically as possible? So off the top, I want to share some sort of 3 broad recommendations that we have come up with. First, I think is, solving for your short-term needs immediately. So really, calculating those revenue losses, right? We know that, even in this past spring term, community colleges in particular saw 11% decline in enrollment at their colleges. This is almost a repeat of what they saw in the fall when there was a 10% decline across those colleges in enrollment. So really, estimating that lost tuition and fee revenue and recouping those losses right away. Similarly with auxiliaries, if your colleges have housing, and that was certainly a big issue last year, but even ongoing or past losses from food service, bookstore, childcare, and parking as well. So recommendation 2 is really thinking about the investment potential of the HEERF funds. So really maximizing that ability to invest forward and think about piloting something new. We encourage colleges to really engage in some creative thinking around things that might be considered a good long-term investment, even without COVID, and then think about how perhaps the HEERF funding could help set that up, right? So you're really meeting your immediate COVID-related needs, but also leveraging those funds to create the infrastructure and support that would be needed anyway to sustain that type of work. So in terms of instruction, that might be, online learning, new modalities, new teaching resources, or new technologies and new pedagogical approaches that are aligned with the new technology. And also rethinking kind of the daily operations around jobs and how people do their work. We've heard from a lot of colleges that, faculty and staff, they enjoy working remotely and sort of would like to continue that part-time. And so there's a lot of questions about how to make that work. And third recommendation sort of is really about making sure you're evaluating all your funding resources. And I know Kate's going to talk about this in a minute with some new resources that are may be available. But certainly from the Department of Ed, we have the HEERF funding. There was also GEER funding, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief, and we know several states have offered competitive grants with those funds for open educational resources or developing low-cost course materials for students, particularly in Pennsylvania, Texas, and Oregon. So those types of strategies have been available. FEMA has had funding for PPE as well as vaccination costs. And then, of course, there's state funds as well, and sort of maybe this upcoming funding that hopefully will be coming up in the Build Back Better grant as well. So really identifying kind of guidelines, timeline, reporting requirements, the priorities of the funders, right, and really making sure you're tying that investment to the right funding source. So I want to turn now and talk about sort of a framework that RPK Group has developed for thinking about how to spend HEERF dollars, and also share some examples that we've come across over the past few months. And this framework really emerged as we've talked with many institutions about their HEERF funding, as the Department of Education has increasingly provided guidance around allowable uses of funds. And we also look at the data for some of the institutions that we've been working with, using their quarterly reporting on how they were spending their early CARES and CARISA funds, or HEERF 1 and HEERF 2 funds. And so importantly, we've really added a time dimension to thinking about spending. So in not time in a sense of how long institutions have to spend these funds, but rather in terms of how long of an impact that spending could have. So sort of transitioning from a spending mindset really to an investing mindset. And so we think that spending can be organized around these four categories that you see here. So starting on the bottom in the gray category, right, this is really just sort of recouping money for things that have already happened. And so campuses have no real control over this. This is really just remedy funding to try and make campuses whole from things that were previously out of their control. Next, moving up the framework on the gray area, we see, spending here is also related to the current environment, right? But it's really focusing on more short-term and immediate needs. So we're seeing some durable expenses that campuses had around laptops and lab equipment. And these are, purchases, but they have a limited lifespan, right? They really need to be replaced over time. Similarly, things like sort of non-durable expenses like PPE, COVID tests, cleaning, right? Those are all things that, are not lasting and need to be repurchased. But as we sort of expand up into the blue areas, this is where colleges really find that they have more agency about how and what to spend their funds on. So they can make decisions about the types of investments that they want to make, right? And whether they want to invest for the long term, and whether that investment might be around IT, whether it might be physical classroom renovations or building related systems like HVAC. But finally, when we get to the pinnacle, which really is kind of where we want colleges to start thinking about, is really this transformative investment, right? And really investing in things that help students succeed, whether that's academic related, health related, or employment related. So let's look at some examples. I'm going to start with the dark gray area here, and then move up and provide some examples for these three areas. So the short-term durable and non-durable, and this was really where we saw sort of a lot of the early spending that occurred, right? Or early spending around COVID safety, around health, right? The PPE and other safety issues. Now that we have a vaccine, funds can be used for vaccine clinics. There were some classroom modifications that were occurring, and a lot of technology, right? So of course we know a lot of folks, campuses have been purchasing laptops and laptop kiosks. One interesting idea that we saw was a sort of a lab kit where they purchased a kit of a camera, a headset, and a tablet. And so it allowed one lab partner to be in the lab actually doing the experiment and connecting in real time with their partner who was off site to maintain that social distancing. There were also investments in staff, certainly providing stipends for bandwidth, as well as to create duplicate workstations in their homes, and also equipping campuses, classrooms, and conference rooms with that technology to accommodate hybrid instruction and meetings as well. Around long-term infrastructure, again, a lot of technology here. I remember talking to faculty early in the pandemic who were unable to access any of their files on their computer because they had no way to VPN in to their desktop. So campuses have been making investments in those VPN services so that staff can access their files from home. Similarly, investing in cybersecurity. Certainly, we've all heard about the Wi-Fi, parking lot Wi-Fi and hotspot stations as well, particularly important for rural areas. We've also heard of some campuses investing in movement technology, so upgrading their swipe card systems on campus so that they're better able to determine how many folks are in a particular building and making sure that it's not overcrowded and there's appropriate space for distancing purposes. As well as some physical space investments. And I think, investing in renewed HVAC systems is common to help with air filtration and prevent the spread of the virus. And certainly minor remodeling is allowed. You can't build a new building, but you certainly are allowed to make those modifications to existing structures. And finally, on the transformative piece here, we've actually seen a fair amount of work in the ed tech space, and we've had some kind of examples in that area. We've heard one campus adopted an AI discussion board software that really engaged students into the class faster and really expected that to be helpful beyond the pandemic. We've also heard of campuses that moved all their tutoring services online and had really great uptake for those services, and were being used heavily and sort of adding more hours around that. We've also heard Georgia State talk about, as you may know, they have a lot of sort of predictive analytics, and I've heard them talk about using that to see when folks hadn't logged on to class and reaching out to provide support. Looking to see, what groups of students were doing okay, who needed help, and it turns out, the first year students really are the ones that need the most support services going forward. And also thinking about student communication, and is there a better way than email? And so investing in chat box technology to try and communicate more quickly and more interactively with students. And then finally, we all know that mental health is obviously a big concern, not only on campuses, but for many folks. But some campuses have been investing in the sort of online mental health supports, and have again found those are quite well attended. Particularly, when they're online, it's really sort of less stigma around walking into a room, and that folks seem to like that option. So as we finish here, I want to just kind of circle back to that, strategic recommendation number 2, right, about investing and how might you invest in some runways. And here's sort of some examples that could be used for this approach. So, for example, when thinking about mental health services again, right, and thinking about, we expect this to be an ongoing mental health issue, even post-pandemic. So investing in, for instance, telemedicine, and using HEERF funds to invest in that modality, right, and getting the infrastructure set up, and so that you can support students now as a result of COVID, but also going further after the pandemic period as well. Advising is another key area, certainly. COVID has disrupted the educational plans of many students. So making investments to help get them back on their academic pathways, whether that would be setting up a new advising model, or investing in new advising technology as well. And finally, in online environments, right? We've had this massive, online experience over the past year, and really taking a look and seeing, what worked and using resources to kind of dig in and say, what worked, what didn't, what are the key learnings, what do we want to incorporate going forward. We've also heard of a lot of interest in high flex delivery models, which, where students can really determine on the day of, do they want to attend class virtually or in person, and setting up those systems to as students move forward and maybe want to do a little bit of both in person and virtual. So I'm going to stop here. I hope this framing and examples stimulated some thinking about potential new areas of need or action on your campuses and start that transition from spending HEERF dollars to investing them in ways that hopefully will have lasting impact.
Excellent. And I see that there's questions that are coming through the Q&A in the chat. I do want to turn it over to Kate, but then we'll double back to the questions before the session ends. So Kate, take it away.
Thank you, Charles. So I don't have slides, partly because most of what I'm going to talk about happened today. So I will apologize in advance that that most of what the information I can convey, I will have to do orally. But I'm sure Charles is tracking the reconciliation bill and can follow up with additional information, or feel free to email me. But I want to pick up where both Donna and Charles left off, and they were talking about HEERF and one-time funding, and the reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better Act, obviously would provide ongoing funding, not completely permanent, probably about 5 years worth, but it is another source of funding, and probably best addressed and focused on those long-term investments that Donna was talking about in student success. So we'll start with just a little bit of detail. As of today, and this is just a framework, so obviously there's no final bill yet, and things may change and likely will change. But as of today, the bill includes, on the student success side, $500 million over 5 years for student success initiatives. There are also within the bill, obviously, investments in the Pell Grants, about $550 addition to the max, or plus up of the max Pell Grant. And that would include for students who are DACA or have TPS status, which is something new that has actually not been there in Pell in the past. But I want to talk specifically about the retention and completion grants, or the student success dollars. And so, as I said, there's $500 million in it. About 95 million of that 500 million is earmarked or can be set aside for spending on programs that would satisfy the highest level of evidence in the education, innovation, and research grant program. So those are programs that have randomized controlled trial level of evidence of their effectiveness. There's another $47.5 million available or proposed in that program that would be for programs that have either that highest level of evidence or have tier 2, so quasi-experimental evidence of their effectiveness on student outcomes. The largest chunk of these 500 million is just $310 million. That is not earmarked for an evidence-based program. The dollars would go to states or state systems. So that's a little different. In the past, the proposal has been structured just as grants to states, but it looks like it is going to be available either to a state or to a state university system. So that is something to look at and see how that might change through the final bill. There's also 37.5 million specifically for tribal colleges and universities. And then there is a $10 million set aside for the Department of Education to do evaluation, given that about $300 million of this program, if it's passed, will go to programs that don't have to have a sort of a designated evidence level or any kind of quasi-experimental or experimental evidence. It's nice to see the department setting aside $10 million for evidence building and for field building of additional programs that could improve student outcomes and student success. So that's kind of what we're looking at. These are the kinds of things that would fall into the allowable uses for these dollars, are the things that I think Donna ticked off as investments in student success, transformative investments, right? So they could be advising. I think Donna talked about intensive advising or different kinds of advising models, right? One of the programs we know that has the deepest level of evidence is the model of a comprehensive approach to student success. and that's the CUNY ASAP model. Also used by other programs like 1 Million Degrees. Donna mentioned Georgia State's MAPS program, Inside Track, Bottom Line. There are a number of other programs like that out there that have randomized control trial evidence of their effectiveness around student success. And those are sorts of investments you could make with HEERF dollars to start a program, and then with the retention and completion fund to continue it over a number of years. Again, that fund at the moment is only a 5-year fund, but it is set up in such a way that it could be easily continued with ongoing appropriations. So I think an investment there would potentially be something that would not run out of money, that Congress would then again, at the end of 5 years, continue the program. When we think about what it constitutes a comprehensive approach to student success, I think most folks on this webinar are likely familiar with the ASAP model, but the real key components there are frequent proactive advising, so small ratios, one advisor to less than 100 students, twice a month kind of meetings. And then it's the tutoring, enhanced services with the advising combined with financial aid, gap grants to cover additional needs like transportation and food, connections to wraparound services at your schools. And I'm sure you're seeing that's more important right now in the COVID and post-COVID era than ever before. Block scheduling and free uses of textbooks. So some of these elements the research shows, work slightly on their own, right? So there is evidence that increases in financial aid will increase persistence or enrollment, but that evidence is less strong than the evidence of doing all of these things together. So I think it's worth considering as an ongoing investment, looking and seeing if a program adding a program like a CUNY ASAP, like a CUNY ACE, if you happen to be a 4-year, like a Georgia State MAPS, some of these that have the deep evidence level, the deep research and evidence level will allow you to use these new retention and completion grant dollars. A couple other things that I saw that Charles mentioned on his slide in terms of momentum building investments that also would fall within the allowable uses of this new fund are things like multiple measures. The evidence there obviously is quite high. The developmental ed, particularly co-requisite enrollment, there's a lot of words, sorry. Investments there as well would probably be an allowable use under these special tiers, not just the sort of 300 million, but within the set aside dollars as well. And then dual enrollment programs as well. Again, they're sort of beyond the comprehensive approaches to student success, that comprehensive advising model. Those are the other components of things that I know Complete College America and some of the institutions that are members have been focusing on that would also be allowable uses under this new fund that hopefully will go beyond just the text that was released today and make it into the final deal. It's a lot of new information, and I apologize again for not having slides to be able to show it to you visually as well as orally. But maybe I'll stop there, and Charles, we can take some questions about some of what's available.
Yeah, that sounds great. And especially if people have questions about developments today, as Kate said, I think, she and I are both tracking those, and, maybe, Kate, I don't know if you'd be open to this, but maybe throwing in the chat some of the highlights that you just said there about the size of the funds. That in particular, and going into that percent base. And then just start. So we did get a lot of questions. I'm going to actually start with the one that's in the chat, and I'll throw it to you, Donna, on, they're very related questions. Basically, is student emergency aid actually working? And, to the extent that it is or isn't, like how much of it is just overwhelming from the unprecedented amounts of money that have been in there. What have you seen in that regard, and in terms of how that also extends to sustainability?
Right. Well, I'll say, most of when we've talked with colleges and universities, we've mostly been focused on the institutional side of their work and the institutional funds, I should say. and really less on the student grants. So I don't have a lot of insight, but my sense is, I mean, we haven't heard anything that's been challenging for them. So actually, my sense was that was going somewhat much more smoothly than than trying to determine what was an allowable use to spend for institutional funds. I think the student grants are much more clear cut. So it wasn't my sense that that's been challenging for institutions.
Cool. Looking at the Q&A, and I want to also share some thoughts before sending these both to Donna and Kate as you see fit in terms of answering. But in regards to professional development, what about opportunities for faculty in a broad range of tech advancements within their field, not necessarily directly related to COVID? I'll just say that from the CCA perspective, we've certainly seen that in HEERF 3, which had a lot more flexibility beyond COVID, because you could go into more broadly student success and retention in general. And while it's very much ongoing and hard to quantify, because there's going to be leading indicators of completion that are impacted by investments that have been made into student success, and then of course that translates years down the road, usually in terms of completion rates and counts, and it gets a little muddled because of the pandemic impacts on retention directly. I would say that one of the things that we're hearing is the more that there's professional development around professional development for groups that typically just did not receive it. So for example, adjunct faculty, right? Being able to provide dollars for any development that would happen there in terms of whether it's digital learning infrastructure type work, pedagogical work, curricular overhaul, that sort of thing has been very beneficial. The other thing is just it's a little broad and thematic, but a lot of the reforms that that we've all touched on, that Kate recently just spoke about with regards to CUNY ASAP or others that I went through with the pillars that Donna went through and the 4 circles and the student success transformation at the biggest, is a lot of them deal with challenges that grapple with uncertainty and lack of support. And of course, the pandemic really made those two things much more exacerbated. And so being able to ramp up those reforms that have been, proven to work even in the pre-pandemic period, actually, address in the pandemic period student uncertainty even better. Like as the problem itself got deeper, the solutions themselves just needed to be turbocharged and deepened as well. So whether that looked like more money for professional development around making sure students are able to progress through their coursework more quickly but responsibly, or making sure that there's really strong career advising, or that you get to that sort of caseload ratio that Kate talked about, was something that was really critical. But Donna and Kate, what would you say in response to that question?
I would say, I think there's a lot of leeway in this. There is a few things that were specifically prohibited, but I think as long as you could show that it's somehow related to COVID, that there's latitude for professional development, certainly around new technologies or how to teach more effectively online, right? To me, those are sort of things that are certainly relevant. We've talked about OER. I do a lot of work in the OER space, and I could see using funds to help faculty create course materials that are more accessible to students that are free, right? So certainly addressing COVID economic needs there. So I think if you're talking about something that's very sort of technically based on your research, I don't see, that might be a little bit hard to justify, but as long as I think it's, related to students or student learning or student advising, or, those types of practices, I think that's it's reasonable.
Other source of fund that Donna touched on that we didn't really dive into were the sort of state and local fiscal dollars, which obviously are not directly available, but are available if you're working obviously with your state and local governments. And those dollars are even more flexible. There's about $350 billion of them, and certainly available for things like addressing the kind of professional development needs and technical capacity and professional capacity to do, particularly for around responding to student needs and even data capacity and things like that. So there is sort of a third bucket that we haven't really talked about that could also be accessed.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I think that, we're, we have a lot that, we're caught up in on the day's events. And, certainly prior to this, the HEERF funds were so significant. So sharing learnings on how that's been spent so far is certainly critical. But obviously, everything that we're talking about applies to one-time funding overall, whether that's from the federal government or federal government to the state, as Kate just mentioned there, or from private philanthropy. I mean, these are the types of principles as we work to just integrate financial operations more closely, and less as just kind of like a back end enabling operation of student success, but absolutely integral to it. And to the extent that the student success strategy you have, the budget for it is just the dollar signs version of that strategy. So it's really about how we're doing this overall. There's a question in regards to marketing expenses for retention and recruitment due to lower enrollment because of COVID. Do you have any guidance related to this? Again, I'll start but go more quickly this time, and then hand it over to Donna and Kate. But just want to call out first and foremost that most of the HEERF money disallowed explicit money going to marketing and recruitment, but the third phase did allow for a more expansive definition, particularly around success and retention. And I think that one of the intersections, right, is that the biggest area where enrollment and retention obviously retention is itself a part of enrollment, and to the extent that it's not semester by semester, but perhaps getting students who have been in college at one time, but may only have some college, no degree. A lot of the work through advising to recapture students in your state who have some college, no degree, represents, kind of a fuzzy line between that recruitment and retention area, and certainly allows for trying to hit attainment goals, because the majority, not the majority, but there's a far more sizable population in every locale of some college, no degree relative to the departing high school class, right? So I think focusing on that area is both good, not just for allowable uses of the funds, but also strategic use of enrollment management in service of completion management. But Donna and Kate, what are your takes on that question?
Actually, that's my mind went as well, Charles, is the re-enrolling some college, no degree, right? I think Colorado comes off the top of my head of a state that actually is using their combination of their ARP and their state and local and HEERF funds together to do a big push around re-enrolling learners who have stopped out. So I do think it is a successful use of a type of marketing, right? A type of dollars, not a pure just marketing to re-enroll anyone, but marketing to think through who are the most vulnerable students who really who've been affected by the COVID pandemic and would benefit most from coming back into school.
Right, I agree. I mean, marketing, direct marketing, and recruitment was, one of the 5 things that were explicitly, not permitted for the funds. But certainly, I think the other way that we've seen it is around this debt relief piece, right? So colleges that are relieving the debt of students that maybe have a balance in the budget office on campus. And by relieving that debt, they're now able to get their transcripts. They're able to, re-enroll either at that institution or another institution, schedule classes. So that's certainly, a mechanism to encourage students to re-enroll, or maybe students who have stopped out to come back because they no longer have that debt that's preventing them from doing that.
So another question in the chat, the suicide rate is increasing on college campuses. Is money allocated for mental health services? And with this and the question that's coming up, I'm interpreting that as HEERF related. And again, we're still finding out, like literally moment to moment right now, what the reconciliation bill is going to contain. I'll start by saying, yeah, like that you definitely could use money for different mental health services. And, we've seen a lot at CCA, but let me turn it over to Donna in terms of, maybe what you've seen and what you would advise.
Yeah, it's definitely an allowable expense. I mean, there's no, explicit, pot of money for that, but I think that's, certainly an allowable expense, and so can be used. And it's a great, as idea, as I shared earlier, to investing now, and we think that's something that's going to certainly persist over time and be needed. So that's a great use of funds.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing. I realize that we neglected to mention this, but that's something that's a direct, or more direct related to the pandemic, right? Because of the mental health issues associated with the public health issues. We talked a lot about emergency aid, of course. There are many colleges that are using this also as a chance to clear debts and to remove the policy of holding transcripts hostage if students have a large or any sort of debt, right? And I think that is even though the second thing is it's related to funding, although it's not about the use of funding, it's really a policy change to allow for students who have financial difficulty to be able to get their transcripts. And then the first is more related, just getting using this as an opportunity to clear debt. And I think we all touched on that, but I don't want to lose it. We have another question. Does purchasing or securing emergency food for campus students qualify under the funding? And we looked at using funds to bolster on-campus food options, and we look to have our task force continue with this. Our intent was to use HEERF as seed dollars. I mean, yeah, definitely. I would strongly recommend doing that and reaching out if you want to have more consultation with any of us on that, because that is a very pertinent, allowable, and smart use of the funds. I don't know if Donna or Kate, if you'd have anything to add to that.
An allowable use, it's probably a good opportunity. Also, it sounds like you're already doing that, thinking about continuing it, to think about how are ways to connect, to use as an opportunity to connect those students on an ongoing basis better to other benefits, right? Like how do they may need emergency food right now, and you use your HEERF dollars, but is there an ongoing conversation or sort of interaction with those students that allows you to connect them to benefits going forward, which is not necessarily about funding, but just about coordination.
Right, building infrastructure, right? So you use the funds to build this infrastructure now so it can persist once the funds are no longer available.
Well, this was great. I hope that you found this helpful and informative. I do want to thank Kate and Donna tremendously for providing very useful information, very pertinent information. Again, considering that intersection of finance and student success and how we actually resource our ability to move forward on a completion agenda, and being able to also provide moment by moment how the federal government is working at levels that seem to always be in flux in terms of being able to fund this agenda. I also realize that this is our last session for the United for Change Week, and so I want to say a thank you, not just for this session, but for this whole week. It's really a very interesting time in higher education. National Student Clearinghouse just came out with another report. We're still seeing similar fall off in terms of enrollment due to pandemic impacts. I know that everybody's stretched to the limit in terms of being able to be there as much as possible for students, and making sure that we're not just looking at making sure that students are going to college, but making sure that we are doing our part to very much stay in the business of creating successful alumni, right? And I know that can be such a challenge, and I think that the sessions this week really zoomed in on how we do that better, how we do the exact strategies that we know that make that work, how we fund it so we can be efficient in its delivery, and how we can best advocate for ourselves, for each other, and for our students. So I certainly felt that was the spirit with which these sessions ended up proceeding, including this one. And I hope that you feel the same, and that there's a great amount of information that everybody was able to pick up, as well as good networking opportunities as we continue to exchange ideas as we all get through this together. So with that, I guess thank you. Thank you for attending this session, and for those of you who have been on multiple this whole week. So thanks so much, and thanks so much for panelists.